This episode is brought to you by Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. In breaking news, leading scientists worldwide are conducting experiments to determine if Reese's Peanut Butter Cups are the perfect combination of peanut butter and chocolate. However, it appears the study was inconclusive, as the scientists couldn't help but eat all the Reese's. Because when you want something sweet, you can't do better than Reese's. Find Reese's now at a store near you.
Robots Radio presents...
In 1939, director Victor Fleming and stars Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable gave the world a melodramatic tale of war, love, and pride.
In 2019, we go back to the world of bourbon at cask strength.
The movie is Gone with the Wind.
The whiskey is Bulleit Barrel Strength.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1939 film Gone with the Wind.
Red, you go. Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Bob, I've never heard of that movie before.
I know, right? It's not like it's one of the most popular films of all time or anything.
Man, I am so excited to wrap up our year of 1939 with what is probably, it's either the most well-known or the second most well-known behind Wizard of Oz. But like this, as a 4-hour epic of a movie, just feels appropriate that we would end our month with this movie.
Absolutely. And Brad, I don't want to speak too far out of turn or too far ahead, but watching this 4-hour movie, I mean, first of all, you can feel every minute of this 4-hour movie. And yet, I can't think of us ending with anything else, because we've gone through the year of 1939, we've had some lows and some highs, but watching this film, there are parts of this movie and the way that it was made that it's hard to believe this is an 80-year-old movie.
Yeah, honestly, this movie does so many different things well in a lot of different ways. My first MVP All-Star award to give this movie, I don't know if I've ever seen a movie that does silhouettes better than this movie.
Oh, that's such a good point. And why don't we get into that in a little bit? Because I want to talk about the cinematography in this movie. But you're absolutely right, Brad. This is just an absolutely breathtakingly beautiful movie.
Yeah, but first, before we get into the beauty and the pitfalls of the movie, we should probably do our favorite segment, Bob.
I think we should. I think it's time for Brad to explain to our listeners the plot of the film Gone with the Wind.
This movie is primarily about a young woman named Scarlett O'Hara. She lives in the deep south of Georgia. Just prior to the Civil War, the movie opens up and she is the belle of the ball. She can get any beau that she wants. She is very self-serving and selfish. And while at a friend's manor, who she is in love with, Mr. Ashley Wilkes, she finds out that he is betrothed to his cousin, Melanie Wilkes. And in a fit of rage, she confronts him and throws something at him, and finds out after he leaves that there's another man in the room that was hiding named Mr. Rhett Butler. And Mr. Rhett Butler is a for-profit war privateer, and he is helping the South, but primarily for his own benefit. He's already apparently a millionaire, and he's continuing to profit off this war, and he's very selfish in his demeanor, and he kind of offends Miss Scarlett O'Hara. Later, the war breaks out, and we see Scarlett travel to Atlanta with some family. She lives with Melanie, who is now Mr. Ashley Wilkes' wife, and she helps Melanie out with birthing a baby and stuff. The city of Atlanta comes under siege by the Union troops. Mr. Rhett Butler comes back into the scene and he heroically rescues Scarlett and Melanie and their servant, and they escape in the night. He goes off to fight with the Confederate troops. She braves a bunch of rain and storms and travel and takes the baby and Melanie to her old homestead, and her old homestead is completely ruined. It's been ravaged by the Union troops, and as she begins to try and work the earth and till the soil, her dad has gone slightly off his rocker, her mother has died, and they try to bring the farm back to not die from being poor and starving. And she vows to herself that she will never again be poor, and that she will, no matter what, pursue money so that she will never feel the effects of poverty again in her life. And that's the first half of the movie. And Bob, for the first time ever, I am going to tap out of Brad Explains and ask that you finish the segment for me.
Well, Brad, if I can kind of put my cards on the table a little bit, I think that you've explained the parts of the movie that are the most important to explain, because that's actually, like you said, that's the first half of the movie. When Scarlett is vowing to never go hungry again, then it's intermission. We come back from intermission, and the rest of the movie is Scarlett in that sort of ruthless pursuit of acquiring things and power, and really Scarlett at her most Scarlett. And this is where she finally gives into Rhett Butler. They get married, but they never really love each other. And the movie kind of devolves. It was always a melodrama, but it really devolves into this sort of soap opera melodrama in the second half. And I think that's probably a good place to end. Brad and Bob Explain.
And I didn't even mention a lot of facts, like she got married to a young soldier who went off and died right away, and she's widowed. And then she marries again in the second half of the movie, and he dies defending her honor, and she's widowed a second time. And then she marries Clark Gable. And like, there's just so much that happens in this movie. I could probably take about 4 hours to explain it.
And I mean, in some ways, it's kind of impressive how much story they're able to tell in one 4-hour movie, because when you think about the number of years that pass and what Scarlett's like at the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie, you know, it kind of is like a Lord of the Rings type epic tale, and yet they pack it all into one movie.
Yeah, I mean, altogether, they probably go through, about 18 to 20 years of time?
I mean, it seems that way. I don't know if it's quite that much, but it's at least 10 years.
Oh, for sure.
So yeah, there's a lot of movie to unpack, and I don't really know how much background I need to give on the film because it is still, to this day, one of the most popular American films of all time. But again, this movie comes out in 1939. It's directed by Victor Fleming, who gets the credit as director, even though he was one of up to 5 directors who had worked on this movie. For 2 years of pre-production, the producer David O. Selznick had been working with another director, George Cukor, who was fired like 3 weeks into the shoot. And there's a lot of gossip, even to this day, about why George Cukor was fired. But he brings in Victor Fleming to finish the movie. And when the movie is released, it becomes the highest grossing film of all time. And to this day, when you adjust for inflation, Gone with the Wind is the most successful and the highest grossing movie of all time in America. It wins 8 Oscars. It's nominated for 6 more. When the American Film Institute releases its list of the top 100 movies in 1998, it comes in at number 4. When they revised the list, it came in at number 6. It is in the IMDb top 250. We are talking about a juggernaut of a movie today, Brad. And I am super excited to get into hearing about your first impressions of Gone with the Wind. Because as far as I know, this was your first time viewing it, right?
Yes, this was most definitely my first time watching this movie.
So, Brad, I'll let you lead us. Where do you want to go first in talking about Gone with the Wind?
As we have said, there's so many different ways to go with this movie. I mean, we can talk about the cinematography, the music, the costuming. There's so many different elements to it. But honestly, the most important part of any movie, in my opinion, is the actors. How do they perform in the film? And so I'd really like to start by talking about some of the performances that we see in this movie. We could probably start outward and move inward towards, Clark Gable and Vivien Leigh.
I think that's a great way to do it. Why don't we start with the person that keeps coming up in our 1939 movies? I want to get your quick thoughts, Brad, on Thomas Mitchell, who is in this movie as Scarlett O'Hara's dad, Gerald O'Hara, who's the owner of the Terra Plantation, and who actually has a pretty good chunk of screen time in this movie. What'd you think of Thomas Mitchell, and how would you compare his performance in this movie to the ones we saw in Stagecoach and in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington?
Well, the funny thing is, if he had the exact same amount of screen time as he does in this movie, in any other movie, he would probably take up like 60 or 70% of the movie. But in this one, he took up about, 15, 20% of the movie.
Yeah, if that.
If that. Yeah, I really loved Thomas Mitchell in this one. He plays Scarlett O'Hara's father. He's an Irishman, nails the Irish accent. He's very soft-spoken and loving, but he's very stubborn about, I'm going to ride my horse and I'm going to jump jumps, and that's that. And, you can't tell me not to. So he's an interesting character. I don't think there's much to work with, but at the very least, that he was very loving and caring, that he loved his daughters and his family and his plantation. I really thought that Thomas Mitchell did a perfect job as a character actor in this role.
Yeah, I agree. And his character really is vital to the movie. I think that, the way that he pampers Scarlett says a lot about Scarlett's character and what her expectations are and why she is the way that she is. You can tell that she gets her stubbornness from him. And like you said, Brad, there really isn't a lot to work with this character. But I saw that Thomas Mitchell found ways to kind of outact everybody in a scene. And it wasn't that it was big and showy. I was really emotionally affected by one thing that he did right before the end of the first half of the movie, when Scarlett finally is able to get out of Atlanta and get home to Terra, and she finds that the house is still standing, and she's so excited to go inside and see her parents. And when she gets to the door, it kind of slowly swings open, and it's her dad standing there, and you can just tell as the audience that he is a shell of what he used to be, and he looks like he's had some sort of mental breakdown. And there's this blank expression on his face as Scarlett throws her arms around him. It's almost like you can see the light bulb go off in his head as he kind of touches her back, and then he realizes that his daughter Scarlett is home. And honestly, that was the only part of this movie that really had me emotional because of Thomas Mitchell's performance. I just think that he is such a fantastic actor, and all of the movies that we've watched him in this month just keep confirming that to me.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that scene for a minute. That was A, one of the most terrifying scenes of the movie, and B, one of the most emotionally heartwarming scenes of the movie, because that door just kind of creaks open, and truly, he is a ghost of himself. He's pale as a sheet standing there, and you can see that his eyes are just kind of gazing, vacantly past Scarlett, his daughter. And it's just one of the best performances where I've ever seen somebody just stand there. Yeah. Just motionless. I've never seen it done better.
All right, so Brad, let's move from Scarlett O'Hara's dad to Scarlett O'Hara's primary love interest. And I am not talking about Rhett Butler. I am talking about the man that she pines for the whole film, Ashley Wilkes, played by Leslie Howard. Brad, what'd you think of Leslie Howard in this movie?
He was sincere in his acting, but and maybe this is my frustration with the script, but he just comes across as so wishy-washy every time he's with Scarlett. And I know that, Clark Gable kind of points that out at the end of the movie, that, he wouldn't put her out of her misery, kept leading her on, or maybe Clark doesn't point it out. Vivian Lee probably does. But I just struggled with him because he's so wishy-washy. He never really firmly commits to being with Melanie, and that drives me nuts throughout the entire movie.
No, I actually think, Brad, I think you're right. I think it is intentional. And maybe the movie doesn't do a good enough job of making it really explicit because you're looking at things from Scarlett's point of view a lot. And she's just in love with this man and doesn't see it. But he totally is wishy-washy. You're right. He doesn't really commit to Melanie. By the end of the movie, he's kind of this like crumpled mass of a man. And I think that's when she finally realizes what she had all along in Rhett. The character of Ashley really plays into a bigger critique that the movie is making. And I hope to get into that a little bit later. But I'm really glad you picked up on the fact that Ashley as a character is not this sort of white knight that Scarlett makes him out to be.
Oh, for sure. He struggles to ever even commit to his wife. She's literally perfect. And so you just kind of struggle where you're like, Ashley, what are you doing, man? Like, stop leading Scarlett O'Hara on. Stop being unfaithful to your wife. Just commit, man. Like, you talk about honor and being a gentleman all the time, and you do see him through the eyes of Scarlett, but he does seem like this white knight that never is actually a white knight. And I really struggled with that. It annoyed me. But if we're talking about just his performance, I still feel like he could have shown more conviction and chutzpah or something. He just felt like he was just bland on screen the entire movie.
Yeah, it's a very flat performance.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect word. He's very flat on screen. And I guess what I would have liked to seen from him as an actor was just a little bit more dynamic range to understand why Scarlett is so attracted to him. You know, Scarlett is this vivacious young woman who chases after life. I would like to see that the man she's desperately in love with for decades of her life to also be somewhat animated and excited about life, not this dour, you know, just kind of boring man who seems like he's 90, even though he's like 20.
And Brad, I'm glad you kind of are leading us into this next character, because the woman that he chooses to pursue instead of Scarlett is who eventually ends up as his wife, Melanie. And I want to talk about Olivia de Havilland as Melanie Wilkes. And I want to say up front that I really struggle with this character and this performance. And I think she's a great actress. And I think that her character does become more human as the movie goes on. I really liked Melanie in the second half of the movie way more than I liked her in the first half of the movie. But I was texting Brad as we were, watching this movie separately. And I think I used the words Virgin Mary and Jesus, because in the first half of this movie, I was rolling my eyes repeatedly at things they had Melanie doing. You know, when she gives up her wedding ring for the war effort, it's played as like she holds out her hand and everyone looks at her hand and she goes, "Perhaps my husband can use it more." And I'm like, oh my gosh, okay. Like, do you have to be this much of a martyr? Do you have to be this perfect?
The thing I feel, though, is that I really was convinced by de Havilland's performance in this movie. And so even in that moment, I was a little bit disgusted by it, but there was just still a part of me that believed it. That was like, she truly would give up her ring to help her husband in the war effort. Like, I wasn't quite as put off by her in the first act as you, even though it was very obvious what type of a role they had put her in.
Yeah, and I think you're right. She totally sells it. Like, not for a minute did I not believe Olivia de Havilland as Melanie. I think my problem has always been, like, the character. And what really set me over the edge was this first scene where Melanie and Scarlett are serving as nurses in the war effort, and it's a nighttime scene. They're reading something to a soldier, and you can see their shadows being cast on the wall by the candlelight, and the camera actually pans away from Scarlett and Melanie, and it focuses on their shadows on the wall. And it's specifically, I mean, in my opinion, it's specifically focusing on the wall because Melanie's silhouette is made to look like the Virgin Mary. And it is like, it's this super blatant, obvious going overboard of, yes, okay, I understand that Melanie is supposed to be like the perfect saint as opposed to Scarlett. And I thought it was just a little too heavy-handed.
Honestly, Bob, one of my struggles with this movie is that I feel like most of the characters are like cardboard cutouts, that they just have one role to play and that they don't really do anything else. And in a weird way, Melanie is the only character that I'm kind of okay with her being a cardboard cutout. Like, I know that she is just depicted as this virginal, perfect saint of a woman who is always going to do the right thing. And so there's something about it that I'm annoyed with that. And yet at the same time, she's so loving and so caring that it's hard for me to be upset with her. Partially because I want people like that to exist in the real world. And so there's something hopeful about having a character like her in this movie that honestly is a pretty dark movie.
And I think what you're getting at is kind of the nature of the genre of this movie, which I would classify as melodrama. And melodrama is one of those things that it's really hard to explain, but I think you know it when you see it. It's that sort of overacted, everything is, the world is falling down around me. It's very soap opera-esque.
Has the war started?
Sir, you should have made your presence known.
In the middle of that beautiful love scene? That wouldn't have been very tactful, would it? But don't worry. Your secret is safe with me.
Sir, you are no gentleman.
And you, miss, are no lady.
Oh.
But don't think that I hold that against you. Ladies have never held any charm for me.
First you take a low, common advantage of me. Then you insult me.
I meant it as a compliment. And I hope to see more of you when you're free of the spell of the elegant Mr. Wilkes. He doesn't strike me as half good enough for a girl of your... what was it? Your passion for living?
And in this movie, what I found was the farther I got into it and the farther the movie went along, once you get used to the melodrama and once you get used to everybody acting in a really heightened way, I was on board. It took a while for me to get on board, but once I bought into the world that this movie was creating, and once I understood that, no, this is just how it's going to be the whole time, and then I think that I could appreciate the performances a little bit more, but you really do have to commit to what they're doing on screen.
It just takes a while to settle in. It's a very different movie. And I would say that, it's historically different, but I'm really happy that we watched the other three movies from 1939 first, because by watching those three movies, it set Gone with the Wind even further apart, because this is a vastly different movie than all three of those movies.
No, it's really true. And I think you're onto something as well. I'm also glad we watched those first three movies when we did, because I think when people think about old movies, Gone with the Wind is one of those films that comes up in the conversation a lot. And a lot of people don't watch old movies because of the way that people used to act, or the way people used to sing, or the way people used to dance. And I think people sort of unfairly look at a movie like Gone with the Wind, where everyone is acting in this really heightened way, and they think, well, that's just what old movies must be like. But watching movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or Stagecoach, no, we've seen much more naturalistic performances in these movies from 80 years ago. Gone with the Wind is definitely something that's set apart from the rest of them.
Honestly, in many ways, a modern comparison for me would be Pride and Prejudice. This movie felt like a British aristocracy period piece that I've seen, multiple times that have been made in the last 20 years. But this was made in 1939, 80 years ago. I mean, I just can't believe that this movie was made at the time it was made.
I don't know how to explain it other than to say that I was surprised at how modern some of the themes in this movie felt. And it really does make you realize that 80 years ago is not that long ago. And yes, they had the Hays Code, the production code, where they couldn't really swear or show anything on screen that would be scandalous. But like you were saying, Brad, there's a lot of sort of darkness in this movie. And I think it really comes out in the characters of Rhett and Scarlett, because they are so manipulative, so narcissistic, so cynical. And the movie doesn't really pull any punches in portraying them that way. I think about old movies and I think they're all happy and simple and there's no really deeper or more complicated things going on. But this movie, on many, many fronts, it kind of forces you to wrestle with it. Is Scarlett a hero? Is Scarlett not a hero? I definitely think she's not. And I think having a complicated character like that as your protagonist is something that I wasn't expecting, at least not to the extent we got it in this movie. I was really impressed by the way that this movie handled some of those more complex themes.
Man, I disagree with your characterization of her as complicated, because she is literally one of the most simple, one-sided characters I have ever seen in a movie. She is selfish, period, through and through, to the end of the movie. She is one of the most selfish human beings I have ever seen, and that is the only thing that drives her through this entire movie. Even after her grand declaration and midway through the movie, all that defines her is selfishness. I could guess what she was going to do at every single turn. She was the most boring character in the world that made lots and lots of noise.
Well, see, I agree with you, Brad. I don't think she is a complicated character. I think that what the movie does is it makes things complicated for the audience because she's the one we follow for 4 hours. And I think having to wrestle with having such a terrible person as your protagonist, it does a lot for the movie. And I think I don't want to give too much away about my analysis of the movie, but I think that Scarlett is a terrible person for a reason. And the movie really kind of gambles on you being able to understand why Scarlett is a terrible person and what they're trying to say with it. But the point I was making was Scarlett and Rhett being these cynical people is kind of a theme or an attitude that you don't see a lot in these older movies. And I was impressed that they were so far ahead of the curve with the sort of cynicism that they presented.
And I really like that they contrasted that cynicism with the grandeur of the Old South. And that, you know, there's kind of this weird sense of optimism in the South. And so their cynicism just plays against that over and over and over in this movie. And so I will say that, you know, they choose a great time period to contrast these characters against.
Well, I think we've kind of put it off long enough. I want to talk about Scarlett O'Hara's character and Vivien Leigh's performance, and also, you know, Rhett Butler, played by Clark Gable. So we've kind of already started talking about Scarlett. Brad, I can very clearly hear what you think of Scarlett's character. But aside from what her character is to you, what did you think about how Vivien Leigh portrayed her in this movie?
She's perfect. Like, she plays the petulant child, the arrogant widow who is wealthy. She plays all those parts extremely well. But the struggle for me is that the script just is so slanted into turning her into this one specific character without a redemptive arc that I struggle to like her as an actress because I don't feel like she's asked to do tons of different things throughout the movie. Like, yes, she moves from more of a selfish child to a selfish, willing, proud adult. But is there really that much difference? She just becomes colder and colder as the movie goes on. And I don't know. She just sobs at the camera the entire movie and tries to get her own way. Was it a good performance? Yes, probably, for sure. But did I like it?
I think that's fair. I will say that I liked it a good deal more than you did. I think that my long-standing criticism of this movie was that Scarlett as a character has no arc and she doesn't change at all. But I think this watch, I actually really appreciated this movie way more than I have in the past. And part of that is because of Vivien Leigh's performance. I was going back before we started recording and I was watching clips of the movie on YouTube. And I watched a clip from the very beginning of the movie. And it's the scene where she first meets Rhett Butler and she's pouting about Ashley not loving her. And then I watched a clip from the end of the movie, and the way she carries herself, her posture, the way that she internalizes things as the years go on and kind of becomes more cold and has that hardened exterior versus the pouty girl that you see in the parlor in that first scene. I really do think Vivien Leigh's performance is way more subtle than we give it credit for because it is in this super melodramatic movie. But the way that she ages the character is done so well. And like I said, once you buy into the melodrama of the movie, I started to notice things about the performance I never did before. You know, I want to go back to that scene where we talked about Thomas Mitchell and how great he was when Scarlett comes home. But once Scarlett finds out her mom is dead, she goes into the room where her mom's body is kind of lying in state. And the camera has this sort of unbroken shot on Scarlett, and it's not a close-up, it's a medium shot. And you watch the realization of her mother's death come over Scarlett. And even knowing that Scarlett is super selfish, and I think her reaction is out of selfishness and not really grieving for her mom, you see like the emotions come up, you see her start to cry, you see her scream. It's this really, really great piece of acting, and it didn't seem over the top. It didn't seem forced in that sort of 1930s way we see sometimes. I really loved Vivien Leigh in this movie.
Yeah, like I said, I don't really have any issues with her performance. I think she did a good job. It's hard to separate her performance from her character for me, and I really hate her character.
Can we play a fun game real quick?
I would love to.
Okay, this game is called Name the Suckiest Thing Scarlett Does That You Can Think of. Because I have a list of like all of the sucky things Scarlett does in this movie, and the list was titled Scarlett Truly Sucks. So yeah. I really want to hear, because she does. She is just a horrible human being throughout the film. I mean, marrying a guy to spite Ashley, and then he dies, and then one-upping that in the second half of the movie when she just completely F's over her sister who's engaged to a guy so that she can then take over his lumber mill, and then he dies. Like, It's kind of a gangster move, I'm not going to lie, but Scarlett is just a terrible, terrible person. All right, so what do you think? What's the suckiest thing Scarlett did in this movie?
Man, honestly, because of the character it affects, I think her continual pursuit of Ashley, whether it's when they were at their lowest at Tara, or when he's running the store, or at any point in the movie when she throws herself at Ashley and says, "Marry me, Ashley. Run away with me, Ashley." Dude, she is screwing over Melanie. Like, how do you do that? You just keep living with her. Melanie loves on Scarlett so faithfully. Every single time, Melanie is there saying, "Oh, don't think poorly of Scarlett. Look at all she's done for us. She's brought us through so much. She does everything she can." She literally defends Scarlett to the ends of the earth and back. Scarlett knows this and continues to pursue after Ashley. I think that is the most down low, disgusting thing that you can do. I was disgusted.
Well, and then to balance her out, you have this character of Rhett Butler, played by Clark Gable. And this character is just so dripping in cynicism, but in that way that he kind of has that wry grin all the time. First of all, I just really love Rhett Butler as a character.
Open your eyes and look at me. No, I don't think I will kiss you. Although you need kissing badly. That's what's wrong with you. You should be kissed and often, and by someone who knows how.
Oh, and I suppose you think you're the proper person.
I might be, if the right moment ever came.
You're a conceited, black-hearted varmint, Red Butler. I don't know why I let you come and see me.
I'll tell you why, Scarlett. Because I'm the only man over 16 and under 60 who's around to show you a good time.
Bob, you might love the character of Rhett Butler, but I have a question for you about him. Is he supposed to be from the South?
So they say he's from Charleston. So
okay. So
I mean,
why
he's accepted as a Southerner.
Why is it then that everybody else in the movie talks with their airs and their graces and why, hello there, Mr. Butler, how you doing today? And then Clark Gable comes on screen and goes, "Hello there." Like, where's his accent?
Two things, because I think you're onto something. First thing is, I mean, then you have to deal with Ashley Wilkes' British accent that keeps coming through the whole movie.
Thank you.
But I think part of it, though, is that even historically, too, in the South, like, you had these people who were moving to the South from Europe, so, like, they weren't going to have this Southern accent. So, I mean, it's possible that Rhett Butler doesn't have an accent. Who knows? But I think you're really onto something, Brad, and it's something we're going to get into in the second half of the show. And it's that I think this movie, and I think the filmmakers, are doing something that even the book Gone with the Wind didn't do. The book Gone with the Wind really does glorify and long for and pine for the lost days of the Old South. And I think this movie, it portrays itself as a movie that pines for and longs for the forgotten days of the Old South. But it really subtly doesn't. And it really, I think, undermines that whole thing. And it takes digs at it. Because the way that this movie portrays all of the Southern men is as this one thing. And then it portrays Rhett Butler as something completely different. And I think that's why Rhett is such a perfect match for Scarlett in this movie, because he sees right through her hypocrisy. At many points, he tells her, "You are not in this for love. I'm not in this for love either. You just want to marry me because of my money. I'm cool with that. Let's just do this thing and let's do it differently than Southern society wants us to do." And that's kind of what attracts Scarlett to him, is because she doesn't care about Southern society either. In the same way he sees through her, Rhett Butler also sees through the hypocrisy and the what he calls the arrogance and the pride of the South as well. The very first time we see him is him arguing with all the Southern men about what a bad idea it is for them to go to war, because they're not thinking logically. They're not thinking with their heads, but they're thinking with all this bravado and arrogance, and he points it out to them. And I think what you're getting at with Clark Gable as very, very different from all these other Southern men was super intentional in this movie.
Yeah, you're probably right with all of that. And I think that Clark Gable as an actor gives us a performance that I would probably say was the best out of anybody in this movie. I mean, you see him move from cynicism into this kind of split personality of love for his daughter And sometimes you can see through the curtain and that he genuinely loves Scarlett, but it quickly gets pulled back behind this veil of cynicism. And so you kind of see glimpses of goodness with him throughout this movie, but he hides it. He keeps pulling it back. And I really love those aspects of his performance.
Brad, I completely agree with you. I think that Clark Gable is phenomenal in this movie. For such a long time in Hollywood, when it was announced that this movie was going to be adapted, people were basically campaigning for him to take this role. You know, he was portrayed as the only person who could possibly play Rhett Butler, and he really didn't want to play it. And, you know, the ironic thing now is, like, he took the role, and it's become the role that he's best known for because it's just so perfect for him. So I think you're absolutely right. But Brad, I think it's time for us to hit pause. We have so much more to talk about with this film. We need to get into our analysis of it. We need to talk about some of the problematic things with this movie as well. But before we do any of that, let's hit pause, and why don't we try Bulleit Barrel Strength?
Let's do it.
Okay, so today we are trying Bulleit Barrel Strength. Now, we've had Bulleit Rye on the podcast before, and we've also had Bulleit Bourbon just a few weeks ago. So now we're moving into one of their other varieties. You know, we've also seen that Bulleit makes a 10-year bourbon. We've not tried that one on the show yet, but we are jumping to their most alcoholic version. This is their Barrel Strength, and it was sent to us by an Instagram follower at the Whiskey Corner, and that's _whiskey_corner. They sent us this sample of Bulleit Barrel Strength and wanted to see what we thought of it. The notes they sent along are that this is from batch number 5 of Bulleit Barrel Strength, and it clocks in at such a high proof that I'm not even going to say it until I get Brad's reaction to trying it.
Man, I'm really excited for this. Honestly, as I smell it, I don't know if I would paint this as a barrel-proof bourbon right off the bat. The ethanol is not hitting me extremely strong. There's tons of pleasant caramel and vanilla notes. There's some spiciness that's kind of playful. It's, you know, dancing around my nose. I'm really enjoying the nose on this.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, Brad, because that was surprising to me as well. I expected to smell nothing but ethanol. And we've, you know, in our day on this podcast, we have tried some whiskeys that smell really, really astringent, really they just reek of alcohol. And this one, you can tell that it has some alcohol content to it, but I'm getting way more spice than I'm getting alcohol burn in my nose. I'm not picking up quite as much sweetness as you are. I get a lot of oak and a lot of spice, which for me, you know, it does not bode well for the taste because I want a little bit of that classic bourbon sweetness on the nose. So I'm going to give it a 6.5 on the nose. Brad, what would you score it?
I'm going to give it an 8. I think it's a really pleasant nose that has some complexity that is intriguing to me.
All right, well, why don't we stop talking about it and give it a sip?
Whew. I tried to sip it carefully, and then it hit the back of my throat, and I just lost it.
Yeah, so here's what I'm getting on this thing. It's really sweet up front, and there's a lot of oak and a lot of pepper. I really don't notice an alcohol burn in my mouth. You can tell, again, you can tell that it has alcohol to it. It's not till you swallow and then you get, it's not even a Kentucky hug. It's like I feel like I have heartburn right now. And I think a lot of people would find something this alcoholic to be really unpleasant. And we'll get to that on the finish, but I actually really liked the taste of this. It has those classic bourbon notes that you were referring to on the nose, Brad. I don't dislike this at all. I think I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the taste.
The taste is beautiful. I mean, the taste is really nice. It's pleasant. It's sweet. It's not overpowering. You can kind of taste that it's a powerful bourbon, but then it hits the back of your throat and it punches you so stinking hard. I am leery to take another sip of it.
Yeah, I didn't quite get it. Again, I didn't get it at all when it was in my mouth. I didn't get it at all when I was swallowing. It was like when it was on the way down, where you normally get that thing we call the Kentucky hug, where it really made me feel like I had heartburn. I suspect some people will really like that. I don't know that I do. But before we get, we're going to get into talking about the finish. Brad, real quick, give it a score on the taste.
I'm going to give it a 7 on the taste. It has a really pleasant kind of vanilla-y note to it. You can taste the spice. And I will say my second sip of this is much better because my throat has already been burned off, so I don't notice that quite as much. But yeah, I'll go ahead and give it a 7 on the taste, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a 2 on the finish because this is brutal. I'm having a hard time talking right now. It burnt so badly going down.
It really is brutal. The word that I wrote down was hardcore. The burn is hardcore. And I kind of suspected that we might differ on the finish. And I can't even necessarily say that I like the finish on this because, again, like it's an experience to go through. But if you're in the market for a barrel strength whiskey and you know that it's going to be super high proof, then I have to kind of think this is what you're going for. And because I think this delivers on that, I actually think the finish does exactly what it's supposed to do. So in a weird way, even if it's not the most enjoyable thing to me, I think it actually works really, really well for what this product is. So I'm going to give it an 8.5 on the finish.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a score of what I'm experiencing and what I think. Because
I can hear your voice just like you're losing your voice as you drink it.
Yeah, this is a rough whiskey on your throat. And if that's what you're looking for, fine. Listen to Bob's 8.5. However, if you're a sensible human being, listen to my 2 and water it down before you drink it. Because
I actually think that might be a good way to go, Brad. If we add a couple drops of water to this, it really might open it up and kind of dilute down a little bit and mellow some of these harsher edges. So Brad, I see that you've put a couple drops of water into yours. Has it changed anything about the taste or the finish for you, aside from just calming it down a bit?
Yeah, it has calmed it down. I am getting more of those oaky flavors that you were talking about. But honestly, this sounds bad. I wish I had watered it down from the start because my throat is genuinely like burnt from this. I'm having a hard time tasting things on the back of my palate. So I can't really give you a fair score on the finish because I don't know what the flavors are on the finish.
Well, maybe that means that it's a good time for us to move into the overall balance. I mean, I picked up on the fact that this was high proof from the nose. It didn't burn as much on the nose as it did on the finish. But I thought that this was a really, really good cask strength bourbon. And Brad, we've only tried a couple cask strengths on the podcast. And I think this one is a really solid entry into that. So overall, I think I'm going to give the balance an 8.
I'm going to give it a 5.5 on balance because they really, and maybe it's a good thing, but they really mask the proof of this bourbon well. And so I guess I knew it was barrel strength. I did not expect the blast that I was going to get from it on my finish.
Well, before we get into overall value, Brad, I think maybe it's time for me to pull the rug out from under you and let you know that what we just drank was, I think, the highest proof whiskey we have ever had on the Film and Whiskey podcast. We did try a sample of a Four Roses cask strength that was up near this, but this bad boy clocks in at 125.4 proof.
Woo-wee.
Now, just for some context, when whiskey goes into the barrel at the distillery, by law, it is not allowed to exceed 125 proof. So what's actually happened is they've put this into the barrel, and then over the course of the years that it's been aging, and the evaporation that comes out as the angels share, and what gets kind of sucked into the wood as the devil's cut, it has made this a little bit more potent. So it came out of the barrel at a higher proof than it's legally even allowed to go into the barrel at. This bad boy really, really packs a punch.
Yeah, it really packs a punch, and I'm curious what the price on this would be so that I can get into my value score.
So in the state of Ohio, a fifth of Bulleit Barrel Strength will run you $49.99. This is not a cheap whiskey by any stretch of the imagination, but you will always find that cask strength whiskeys are about double what you would pay for the sort of regular expression. It happens with Elijah Craig. It happens with Maker's Mark. This is really right in line with what you'd see for a barrel strength bourbon.
Yeah, so if you know what you're getting into, then I would probably say that this is a good value. $50 isn't high-end scotch. It's not something that's going to blow your wallet out of the water, but it still is a lot of money for a bourbon that I personally would never buy. So I would struggle to give it a high score. I will give it a 6.5. I think it's a fair value for what you're getting.
And I understand your point of view, Brad. I actually really like barrel strength bourbons and whiskeys in general. I think that they are challenging. I think you have to sip them a little bit slower. I also would be hesitant to spend $50 on most bottles of whiskey because a lot of our podcast has focused on bargain and budget whiskeys, and we both really liked regular Bulleit for the price. If this was at a bar and they were charging, $8 for a shot of it, I would absolutely go for it. I think this is something that you drink on a special occasion. This is something that you drink to kind of shake yourself out of the routine or the norm of what you would normally drink. I don't think it's a bad value, like I said, especially in line with other barrel strength whiskeys. But I'm only going to give it a 7 on value, just because we've had so many other whiskeys that I think are slightly better that are under this price point. So that puts me out to a 37.5 out of 50. I really did like this product a lot. Brad, I'm sure that you liked it less than I did.
Yeah, this might be one of our biggest differences in whiskey scores. I came out to a 29 out of 50.
So that puts us out to an average of a 33.25 or a 66.5. I'm actually okay with this being there. It's upper 2/3. I think we can both appreciate that this is a well-made product. It's just something that I can tell, Brad, that you just are not going to go in for this, and you're either on board for it or you're not.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I guess it's one of those things where I don't think that there's much chest thumping to do about, oh, well, I drink higher proof bourbon than you do, so I'm better at drinking whiskey. I'm sorry, but that's just not necessarily the case. Is this a good whiskey that's well made? Yeah, but I personally don't enjoy crazy high proof whiskeys. I max out at about 110 proof, which itself is a pretty high proof whiskey. So I'm going to stay away from the barrel proof whiskeys more often than not.
And that's reasonable. And that's the thing that we like to encourage on the Film and Whiskey podcast is drink the kind of whiskey that you like to drink. Are we going to ask you to expand, your palate a little bit? Yeah, absolutely. That's why Brad and I start drinking scotch instead of just bourbon. That's why we branch out into Irish whiskey and rye and hopefully soon Japanese whiskey. We want to try new things, but at the end of the day, everyone knows what kind of whiskeys I like to drink, and that's always just going to be my preference. And you don't have to feel inferior for not liking something that your friend likes because everybody's palate is different and everybody's preferences are different.
And I think that's a perfect way to segue us back into talking about Gone with the Wind, because I would say that it is an extremely high-proof, challenging movie that a lot of modern viewers would struggle with, that it doesn't matter if you like it or not. Just because, a bunch of movie whizzes say it's a perfect movie or something doesn't mean you have to like it. So, Bob, what do you say we get back into it?
Let's do it. All right, so that was Bulleit Barrel Strength, which is apparently a very polarizing whiskey to drink. And I guess it kind of does suit what we're talking about today, because Gone with the Wind is a very polarizing movie, especially in 2019. But Brad, before we get into the political minefield that is talking about Gone with the Wind in 2019, I just want to take a step back. I want to look at this movie from kind of a technical standpoint. And I want to get back to something you were saying in the first half of the podcast about what you really appreciated with the cinematography, the shots in this movie, the way the camera's used. Why don't you walk us through what you appreciated about that?
Well, one of the most beautiful aspects of this movie that I already mentioned was the way that they use silhouetting. You kind of talked about the shot where they have Melanie and Scarlett standing together, and Melanie kind of looks like the Virgin Mary, her silhouette does against the wall. But that scene is just absolutely spectacular. I think about at the very end of the movie when she's standing at Tara and she's silhouetted against the sunrise or the sunset, whatever it is. And the camera kind of slowly falls back and you see the tree grow and the sunrise grow and the house grow. The way they silhouette in this movie is beautiful. The hands down best one by far is when they are escaping from Atlanta.
Oh, yeah.
And you see Clark Gable standing forward, whipping the horse to go faster. And this building that just appears larger than life is on fire behind them, just casting this light over them. It is one of the most beautiful scenes I have seen in any movie, period.
Yeah, the shot of that warehouse collapsing. I mean, first of all, that was actually done. You know, it clearly wasn't the real actors, it was stunt people. But they basically burned down an old backlot of sets that weren't being used. And, you know, some tellings of the story will actually say that the producer, David O. Selznick, was on set and actually exploded each one of those boxes of explosives with a detonator himself, because that was his backlot that he was kind of raising for this movie. And I think that's a really interesting tidbit, but you're completely right, Brad. The silhouetting in this movie is just, it's such this great artistic touch. Aside from the one you're just talking about, which is in a huge action sequence, I think my favorite one in the film is when Melanie's about to give birth. Scarlett's in the room with her talking to Melanie, and they use silhouette in that scene as well because the blinds are closed, and so you only see Scarlett and Melanie in silhouette. And I really love the decision to do that because it's at this really dramatic moment. It's at a really tense moment. But in 1939, I just don't think they could accurately portray childbirth in general. I think it would have looked really hokey and fake in 1939 in broad daylight. And the decision to put them in silhouette and to hide their faces in shadow, I think really actually ups the ante on that scene and makes it even more effective.
Yeah, the cinematography in this movie is just spectacular. And not even just the silhouetting, but the way the camera moves, you know, that shot where the door creaks open and you see Thomas Mitchell is just standing there, you know, white as a ghost. The way they shoot this movie is stunning for the era that it was shot in.
Well, I want to talk about one other thing before we get into our analysis, Brad, and that would be the music in the movie. The music was composed by Max Steiner, who has done at least 2 other movies that we've done on the podcast. He did Casablanca and Treasure of the Sierra Madre, if I'm not mistaken. And listening to the music in this movie, which takes up, I'm pretty sure I read that the score of this film is in 2.5 hours of the film. So it is a huge chunk of music that had to be written for this movie. It makes me even more upset when you informed me a couple weeks ago that Stagecoach won an Oscar for Best Score and Gone with the Wind didn't. Because first of all, it's one of the most famous themes in movie history. People just know the Gone with the Wind music. I mean, it's just such a monumental piece of music. I can't believe this movie or this score didn't win an Oscar.
Yeah, I really struggled with the musical score because it just felt so soap opera-y that every time you expected it to make you sad, it was sad. Every time you expected it to be happy, it was overly happy. Like, just like all of the characters being a cardboard cutout of, you know, an emotion or a feeling or something, the music just felt like a cardboard cutout of now you feel happy, now you feel sad, now you feel angry, beating me over the head with feelings that I didn't really care about because I'm watching a soap opera.
Oh, man. Yeah. See, I think that we're just going to have to agree to disagree on this one. I'm still mad that Stagecoach won an Oscar, and apparently it's a grudge that has been held for 80 years. So maybe it's time for us to move into our analysis on the movie, Brad. We've been building this up for a while. What we've been doing this season when we come back from our whiskey break is we've been doing a segment called Hot Takes. I think that we're going to not do hot takes this week. And I think that's a decision we're making because when you read negative reviews of Gone with the Wind, I think a lot of them are very valid. A lot of people in 2019 will not watch Gone with the Wind. And I think sometimes people don't watch this movie and they're not considering it enough. And I'll get into that in my analysis of the movie. But I think that there's also a lot of people who watch this film, especially people of color, and they see the way that people of color are treated in this movie. And because of that treatment, they cannot watch this movie and they'll give this movie a 1-star review. And I think that's actually, of all the reasons you can give a movie a 1-star review, that's a really valid reason. And I don't want to make light of that. And so I don't think hot takes is really an appropriate thing to do this week. And Brad, you also said that you wanted to talk about the way that the people of color in this movie are represented or portrayed on screen. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about it.
This topic is such a struggle because all in all, people of color are presented extremely positively in this movie. You know, there is no way that Scarlett O'Hara could have made it as far as she did without the character of Mammy. You know, she is her nurse when she's young and cares for her, and she says many times, like, I change your mama's diapers and your daughter's diapers. And in a lot of ways, she is the core of that family and keeps Scarlett O'Hara running for a long time. You know, when you look at the way that their male slaves and then servants are treated and the way that they act towards Scarlett and Mr. O'Hara, they're always respectful and kind and caring. And so on one hand, you have them portrayed in this extremely positive light of not just serving the O'Haras, but genuinely loving them and caring for them. But on the other hand, you see the way that Scarlett treats them as less than human. You know, day in and day out, she just treats them terribly. And granted, she treats everybody terribly. But overall, the portrayal is just problematic. I especially think about the younger servant that they have that at first she says that she can help with the baby and then says, I can't help with the baby. I know nothing about babies. And that character especially was problematic for me. I just struggled because the writers of the script continually put her in positions where she just looked like an idiot.
Yeah.
She just looked so stupid and so dumb. And I just was like, what is happening? And granted, they made the character of, you know, Mama and some of the male servants look much smarter than that one female character. But man, it was a struggle for me.
Yeah, and Brad, I feel like I even need to parse out a little bit of what you said too, because, you know, you said that the majority of the black characters in this movie are portrayed positively. And I feel like I would even push back a little bit on that, because I agree with what you said about how they are portrayed with positive attitudes or how they're helpful. But I don't know that it's necessarily a positive portrayal of black people in this movie, because like you said, pretty much everyone except Mammy is portrayed as really dumb or really helpless at some point in the movie. I mean, maybe not Big Sam, but even Big Sam is kind of the butt of a joke at the very beginning of the movie where he's arguing with somebody else about who's the foreman out in the fields. And the joke is like, they're not very bright. They're arguing about these things. Here's the thing with slavery in this movie. I think the handling of the slavery element in this movie is so muddied. And I think that's why you said you struggle with it, Brad. And it's what makes this movie hard to watch and hard to talk about, because on the one hand, you have the character of Mammy, played by Hattie McDaniel, who wins an Oscar for this movie. And Mammy is able to like call out Scarlett. She's able to say things that no other character in the movie can say to Scarlett. But then on the other hand, you have the other house slaves portrayed as idiots. When Scarlett comes back home to Tara at the end of the first act of the movie, all of the slaves are asking her to basically mother them. And one of them says, like, who's going to milk that cow? We're house servants. We don't know how to milk a cow. And like, it's just dripping with this helplessness. And I think the thing that really, really, really irks me about the slavery portrayed in this film is that for as much as this movie critiques the arrogance of the South before the Civil War, they never really go in on critiquing slavery as an institution. And yes, I understand that this is told from a Southern point of view, but the way they portray the slaves in this movie is that the slaves are like happy to be out working in the fields. We never see any negative impacts of slavery. We never see any person get whipped. We never see anybody get sold. And it really does kind of explicitly show slavery as not that bad. And so you have on one hand what I think is a movie that's kind of critiquing the South, and then on the other hand, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, because they're not really critiquing it on all fronts. When I watch this movie and I see images like at the very beginning of the movie where they all go to 12 Oaks and there's this little girl who's a house slave fanning the white people while they nap and she's sweating. And it's like, I can't tell if this movie is purposely showing me this because they're trying to show me the hypocrisy or not, because they never make a point of it. It's just there and they don't touch on it. And I think it's kind of irresponsible to not touch on it. It's too unsettling for me to see stuff like that and have absolutely no comment on it. And I get that the people in the movie think it's okay, but if the filmmakers are trying to do something else, then you have to spend some time commenting on these things. And this movie just doesn't do that.
Yeah, Bob, I totally agree with you. This was a huge struggle for me. And honestly, there's a few scenes that you just mentioned that I'd just kind of forgotten about because of how long the movie is. But yeah, when the slaves are fanning all of the white women who are taking a nap in the middle of the day, which we can slide past how weird that was. But beyond that, when you look at the way that people of color were treated in this movie, you're right. The filmmakers take no moral or ethical stance on the institution of slavery, and that in itself is a problem. And part of me will say, hey, it was 1939. They did not think about race in the same way that we do today. But I also think it's okay for us in 2019 to come back and at the very least point out that, hey, maybe they had an opportunity to advance the discussion on race relations and they didn't take that opportunity. But it is something that they missed out on that they could have done.
Well, and I think that we can't even let them off the hook that easily, because David O. Selznick at many points had actually written memos in the studio, and he was conversing with the NAACP about how he really intended to portray black people in this movie in a positive light. And to his credit, Brad, and to what you were saying, I think in some ways they succeeded at that with specific characters. But one thing that Selznick was really worried about was that if they portrayed certain things the wrong way in this movie, that people would boycott, that people would riot, and that it would have negative consequences. There was a really famous movie that came out in 1915 called The Birth of a Nation. It was the most popular movie in American history, and that movie depicts the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And it was a long, epic, silent movie. And if you watch it today, it's horrifying because it absolutely glorifies the Ku Klux Klan and it demeans black people as less than human. And Selznick was really worried that if this movie came across the wrong way, he was going to feed into that same thing, because when Birth of a Nation came out, the Ku Klux Klan actually saw membership rise. And so Selznick was super worried about it. And part of me looks at that and says, okay, well, if you're worried about it, why didn't you go a little harder on denouncing slavery and denouncing looking at black people as less than human? Because at the end of the day, I don't see that effort really put into this movie. And I think Selznick at the end of the day was more worried about making a buck and not offending the American South than he was actually taking the stance that he says he was going to take.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you, Bob. There's a lot of issues with this. And I think one of the other big issues is that people of color are just not the focus of this movie. The only thing this movie cares about is Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler. And it unfortunately limits the scope of the conversation you can have about race relations. And I think it does it in a negative way. You really miss out on a lot of opportunities to denounce the institution of slavery, and they don't do it.
And they gloss over so much. You know, the scene where, and it's a very tense, suspenseful scene, where all of the women are kind of in a knitting circle and they're waiting on their husbands to come home from what they're calling a political meeting, right? And then Rhett Butler has to come and cover up for them because they were actually raiding the shanty town where Scarlett almost got raped. Well, when you really stop to think about it, they're calling it a political meeting, but what really is going on during the Reconstruction period in the South is that there is a group that's starting to rise in the South that is taking vigilante justice into their own hands. And if you read the book Gone with the Wind, it's spelled out super explicitly. All of their husbands, including Ashley Wilkes, are members of the Ku Klux Klan. It's portrayed in a sort of way that they are defending the honor of the women of the Old South. And I feel like in this movie, they just gloss right over that fact. And we're just supposed to kind of, understand implicitly that all their husbands are in the Klan. And we're just going to move right along past that thing.
I won't lie. I did not pick up on any idea that they were in the Klan, and I probably should have, but that just kind of went right past me.
But that plays into what you're saying, though. This movie is so unconcerned with those details, and it's trying to distract you so much with the melodrama that it doesn't even give any time to those things.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. But yeah, overall, this movie is just inconsistent in its treatment of people of color, and it's a problem.
I will say though, Brad, and this is the point I wanted to make about my analysis of this movie. I think slavery is a really good inroad. The way this movie treats slavery is a really good inroad into talking about what I think this movie is actually doing, because I think this movie is trying to be a critique of the Old South and the philosophy of the South will rise again. And first of all, I know we have a lot of listeners from the American South, and as I talk about what I think this movie is saying, I'm not saying anything negative about our friends that live in the South. I'm not saying anything about my opinion of the South. I think this movie definitely has an opinion, and so I want to convey what I think this movie is saying. But this movie I think it really goes hard on the Old South. When you look at the way this movie treats slavery, the only person in the movie that ever really denounces slavery as an institution, and it's in a roundabout way, is Ashley Wilkes. There's one point where Scarlett starts up this lumberyard and she hires a bunch of convicts to work it. And Ashley says, I wish you would just let me hire some free, he calls them free darkies, to work this lumber mill. And he says, I won't stand by you exploiting the labor of these convicts. And Scarlett kind of calls him out and says, you had slaves. And then Ashley says, well, that was different. We treated the slaves so well, and I would have freed them anyway. And it's just this eye-rolling, like, okay, you would have freed them anyway? Really, that's what you're going to go with? And you're going to say that, like, you treated your slaves well? But I actually think that the fact they gave that line to Ashley Wilkes is actually a key to the whole movie. Brad and I were watching this video on YouTube. I really highly suggest people go find it. It's called Should We Still Be Watching Gone with the Wind? And it's by a guy called Cold Crash Pictures. And he points this out. Ashley Wilkes is the most wishy-washy character in the whole movie. And because he's super wishy-washy, when they put those words in his mouth, we're not supposed to completely buy what he's saying. It's not like Rhett Butler says, well, we treat the slaves really well. It's not like Melanie Wilkes says, we treat the slaves really well. And I was getting at this earlier in the podcast. I think the way that this movie looks at the Southern gentleman is that they are so blinded by their arrogance leading into the Civil War that they don't see what's ahead of them. And that's why I talked about Rhett Butler seeing through them the same way Rhett Butler sees through Scarlett O'Hara.
Yeah.
And I think that what this movie is doing is the reason Scarlett O'Hara is the protagonist of this movie, the reason we watch her for 4 hours be a terrible person and we have to put up with her, is because I think Scarlett is a symbol for the American South. At the beginning of the movie, she is just as full of willful ignorance and arrogance that the movie accuses these Southern gentlemen of being. Anytime she's faced with a decision or she's faced with the consequences of her actions, what does she say? Her famous line is, I'll think about it tomorrow. And then when the war hits, just like the South, Scarlett gets exposed to the horrors of war. She's brought low. She's laid bare. By the end of the film, after all of her fighting to claw her way back to the top, she still goes back to Tara. She feels like she has to retreat back to Tara to get her bearings again. And what I think this movie is saying is that Scarlett is like the Old South. Tara is a symbol for the Old South. Scarlett keeps looking for it because she continually wants to go back to the way things were. For her, Tara represents this really simplistic time where she didn't have to work for anything. And at the end of the movie, when she goes back to Tara, I think people look at that as like a happy ending, but I don't see the ending of the movie that way at all. She has no children left, according to this movie. They're dead. She has no husband. She's utterly alone. And she feels like she has to go back to Tara to regroup and get her life together. And I think this movie is kind of making the point that just like Scarlett, in 1939, these feelings of the South will rise again were really starting to come to fruition. And I think this movie looks at the American South the same way it looks at Scarlett. They're trying to long for these days that are past. I mean, the title of the movie is They're Gone with the Wind. Scarlett never actually learns better. She's still holding out hope for something that's actually gone. And so I think this movie is really looking at Scarlett and looking at the story of the American South as a tragedy. This isn't the kind of movie you're supposed to walk out of feeling encouraged and impassioned by. Because just like at the beginning of the movie, Scarlett's last line really is, I'll think about this tomorrow. Tomorrow's another day.
Red Earth of Tara. 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 Tara.
I'll think of some way to get him back. After all, tomorrow is another day.
She's still unwilling to face the consequences of her actions, and in the same way, I think where this movie leaves off is that as long as the South is still looking behind instead of looking ahead, it's just going to keep repeating this cycle of destruction. And so I actually really love what this movie is trying to say. I don't think it always does it super successfully, but that's why I appreciate this movie so much.
I would mostly agree with your take on this. I think I would just differ slightly in saying that I think her obsession with Ashley Wilkes, which takes up 90% of the movie till the last, 10 minutes, I think that obsession kind of represents her obsession with the South. Because I think Ashley Wilkes represents the wishy-washy gentleman nature of the South, of this genteel front that people put forward, where they keep saying, well, I'll do this for you, I'll do that for you, and I'll fight for this, and it'll be over in a month. But it never comes to fruition because it's not based in reality. And so I think at the end of the movie, she finally realizes that that is not for her, that that's not her true love, that her true love is Rhett Butler, the man of the world, the man who understands reality. And so by returning to Tara and planning how to get him back, it almost feels like she, representing the South, is returning to its roots so that it can reconnect with the world around it in a new and different way without Ashley Wilkes.
I actually think that that's a really good way to read it as well, and that's the more optimistic ending, right? Which is maybe the South finally can get over these things that it has seen through. Because at the end of the movie, I think she finally realizes Ashley's kind of a bum, and I don't really need to be in love with him anymore.
Yeah, that's essentially it. And if you take Ashley to represent the genteel, gentlemanly nature, then they're kind of over it. They've realized that has gotten them nowhere. In fact, it has brought them lower than they've ever been before. And so she moves past that and is retreating to, her land. I love at the start of the movie when Thomas Mitchell, says like, this land is what matters. It's what keeps us together. It's what people are willing to fight for. That, you retreat back to your land to find yourself and find new ways to interact with the world around you. And yeah, maybe it is a very optimistic ending, but man, I really hope that that's one of the meanings people can take from this movie.
Well, we have gone super duper long today. Brad, I think that it was kind of necessary because of all the things we needed to talk about, but it's also a 4-hour movie. So, forgive us a little bit for running long. But this is definitely the time for us to give our final scores on this movie. And Brad, first time through Gone with the Wind, what'd you think of it? What score would you give it? And would you recommend?
Bob, for everything that I said of things I liked, things I disliked, so on and so forth, I genuinely just think that the reason this movie was so popular, more popular than any other movie in American history, is for the simple fact that soap operas had not been invented yet. And I think that this is not a great movie. I genuinely struggled with this entire movie. There's so many problems with how it depicts things. There's so many things in this movie I didn't like, whether it was the acting or the script or even the cinematography, the way it would just like zoom in really fast on certain faces when they were getting upset or emotional. Like it felt like I was watching a soap opera. And then I realized that I was watching the great granddaddy of them all. Like this is the soap opera that birthed every other soap opera that's ever been created. And I recognize the history that this film has, but I'm going to give this movie a 6 out of 10. I really don't like this movie. I am giving it that high of a score because I recognize the history that it has, and I recognize that it does certain things spectacularly. But overall, I cannot recommend this movie. It is mind-numbingly dramatic. It just blows my mind that this was so popular in 1939. I literally can't understand why people loved this movie and saw it time and time again.
So I actually had the opposite experience that you did, Brad. I have never really been a huge fan of this movie. I've always appreciated the spectacle of it, the epic sort of nature of it, but I was ready to come into the studio today and just kind of dump all over this movie because I always found it kind of boring. I always thought that it was very surface level. I always thought that because I could only see the surface level of it, that it had nothing to say and that the things it did say were super problematic.
Can I say one thing just really quick? I actually wasn't bored by this movie. Like, it genuinely moves you through. There's a few slow parts, but as many people that say it's bored, I actually wasn't necessarily bored by this movie.
I think that's encouraging because to be able to hold someone's attention for 4 hours is no small feat. But I was ready to come in here and just trash this thing. And I actually found that there was so much more going on under the surface than I had ever noticed before. And maybe I just wasn't looking for it, or maybe I wasn't ready to engage with this movie on that level yet. But I was shocked at how modern it felt, at how complex of a critique it kind of offered. Once I finally started to realize that Scarlet was a symbol for the South, I think things really started to click for me. And all of that, coupled with the technical brilliance of this movie, I mean, it really is one of the most beautiful movies I've ever seen. I'm still blown away by some of the camera movements, that crane shot of Scarlet walking through the street in Atlanta with all the dead soldiers. Like, it's just, how could you not love certain things about this movie? And I think that all of that added together, I have to give this movie a 9.5 out of 10. I don't think it's perfect. I really do think that all of the critiques we talked about with slavery and how this movie didn't go hard enough are valid. And I recognize that some people may not even watch this movie because they don't want to engage with it on that level. And I completely understand and respect that. But on a storytelling level and on a technical level, it's hard to top this movie. It takes its place in the American canon for a reason. And I really, truly loved watching this movie. So I'm as shocked as anybody might be, but I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10.
Well, frankly, Bob, I don't give a damn about your score.
So that puts our final score out to a 7.75 out of 10. But we want to know what you think. So please, you deserve to have some input. So we want to hear from you. Get on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, or on Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or you can give us a call. Our call-in line is 216-800-5923. Once again, our call-in line is 216-800-5923.
We are so grateful that you stuck with us through this episode and through our month of looking at films from 1939. We are going to be back next week talking about one of the most controversial films ever made. For its 30th anniversary, we're looking at 1989's Do the Right Thing. For the Film and Whiskey Podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
We'll see you next time.
She helps deliver a baby there. Atlanta comes under siege by the Union troops. They escape. Yeah,
you left out a whole character,
I'm
dude.
well aware. God, this movie sucks.